They weren't just warriors, they were survival engineers. From brutal weapons most people have never heard of, to ingenious survival strategies forged in ice and war, and longhouses so cleverly built, it's as if Vikings had blueprints from the future. This isn't just about raiding and pillaging, it's about the raw, clever, primitive genius that kept them alive in one of history's harshest environments. Get ready to uncover the forgotten tech, tactics, and toughness that made the Vikings unstoppable. In today's video, we'll explore 10 of the most brutal Viking weapons that rarely make it into Hollywood depictions. While swords steal the spotlight in popular culture, they were luxury items for the elite. Most Vikings wielded far more brutal and surprisingly ingenious weapons. These weapons weren't merely designed to kill, they were crafted to maximize damage while serving multiple purposes, reflecting a culture where resourcefulness was as valuable as raw strength. From farming tools repurposed for battle to armor-shattering inventions, these forgotten weapons reveal why Norse raiders struck fear across medieval Europe. Let's begin. While axes are certainly associated with Vikings, the specialized skegox, or bearded axe, remains less familiar to most. What makes this weapon distinctive is its asymmetrical blade with an elongated beard, or lower edge, that extends down and back toward the handle. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a lethal design innovation. The extended lower edge served multiple deadly purposes. It allowed warriors to hook an opponent's shield or weapon, pulling it down or away to create an opening for a lethal strike. This hooking capability made the bearded axe particularly effective at disarming opponents or dragging a shield aside just long enough to deliver a finishing blow with the upper edge of the blade. Archaeological findings show these axes were usually 15 to 20 inches in length, easily wielded with one hand while holding a shield in the other. The skegox's brutal effectiveness came from its versatility. It could deliver crushing blows through chainmail, hook limbs to topple opponents, and even serve as a utility tool when not in battle. Bearded axes found in grave sites often show signs of both combat damage and wear from everyday use, highlighting the Vikings' practical approach to their weapons. Mentioned prominently in Norse sagas, yet often overlooked in popular culture, the Atgeir was a fearsome polearm that combined the reach of a spear with the cutting power of an axe. The weapon features a long wooden shaft, topped with a spear point, and one or more auxiliary blades or hooks extending from the sides. The Icelandic sagas speak of the Atgeir with particular reverence. In Njáls saga, the character Gunnar of Hlíðarendi is described wielding his Atgeir with such skill that it sang as it cut through the air, before cleaving both armor and flesh. The saga describes how no shield could withstand it when properly wielded. The Atgeir proved devastating in formation fighting due to its extended reach, allowing warriors to strike from behind the shield wall. Its secondary blades could effectively hook enemy shields or inflict horrific slashing wounds. With a balanced design enabling quick recovery after thrusts, this versatile weapon excelled in both offensive charges and defensive stands. Unlike many weapons that required years of training, the Atgeir's design made it relatively straightforward to use effectively with basic instruction, making it ideal for the Vikings' societal structure, where all free men were expected to fight when called upon. Perhaps the most ubiquitous yet underappreciated Viking weapon was the seax, a single-edged knife that blurred the line between tool and weapon. Every Viking, regardless of social status, would have carried a seax. These knives range from small utility blades about 5 inches long to formidable langsax versions, reaching up to 20 inches, effectively short swords. The seax's brutal efficiency came from its design. A thick, heavy back edge provided weight for crushing force, while the single sharp edge could be maintained at extreme sharpness. The blade typically featured a distinctive broken back design, with the spine angling down toward the point. creating an ideal stabbing geometry that could puncture even mail armor when driven with sufficient force. What made the seax particularly dangerous was its omnipresence and concealability. While swords would be set aside during peaceful meetings or in certain settings, the seax was considered a tool and thus remained on its owner's person at virtually all times. Norse graves consistently include seaxes alongside everyday items, revealing how integrated these weapons were into daily life. Historical accounts tell of Vikings using seaxes with devastating effect in close-quarter combat situations where larger weapons became unwieldy. The langseax represents the largest variant of the seax family, occupying a middle ground between knife and sword. With blades typically measuring between 12 to 20 inches, these weapons were substantial enough for serious combat, but more accessible than the expensive swords reserved for elites. Archaeological findings from Viking settlements and burial sites across Scandinavia and England show langseaxes were particularly common during the 9th and 10th centuries, coinciding with the height of Viking expansion. Unlike the standard seax, which curved downward at the tip, many langseaxes featured a more sword-like profile with a straighter spine ending in a clipped point. With a thick spine and single-edged blade, the langseax concentrated force precisely where needed, shearing through padded armor with terrifying effectiveness. Despite this power, warriors wielded it with surprising speed in tight quarters. The substantial tang, the portion of the blade extending into the handle, often ran the full length of the wooden or bone grip, ensuring these weapons could withstand the shock of blocking even the heaviest strikes. The langseax served as a status symbol for successful raiders and freemen who couldn't afford swords but had progressed beyond basic weapons. Many examples feature simple but distinctive pattern welding in the blade and decorative elements on the handle, showing they were valued possessions rather than mere tools. The krokspjord represents one of the more specialized weapons in the Viking arsenal. This hooked spear featured a standard spearhead with the addition of one or more backward-facing hooks forged into the blade or socket. While less common than standard spears, sagas and archaeological findings confirm these weapons saw use, particularly among warriors who specialized in anti-cavalry tactics or shield wall combat. The practical brutality of the krokspjord becomes evident when considering its function. Once the weapon penetrated flesh, the hook made extraction exceedingly difficult and traumatic. Pulling away from a standard spear might allow an injured opponent to retreat. The krokspjord ensured that withdrawal would cause catastrophic additional damage, as the hook tore through tissue. Beyond inflicting horrific wounds, the krokspjord excelled at a key Viking combat tactic: shield manipulation. The hook could catch the rim of an enemy's shield, allowing the wielder to pull it down or aside, creating an opening for allies to exploit. In the densely packed shield walls where much of Viking combat occurred, creating even momentary vulnerabilities often proved decisive. The sagas describe the krokspjord as a weapon that caused particular fear among opponents, not just for its physical damage, but for the psychological impact. The prospect of being caught by such a weapon added another dimension of terror to facing Viking raiders. The kestja represents another polearm from the Viking arsenal, similar to, but distinct from the atgeir. Norse sagas describe it as a heavy thrusting and cutting weapon with a substantial blade. Based on literary descriptions and limited archaeological evidence, the kestja appears to have been a versatile polearm with a longer and heavier blade than standard spears. What separated the kestja from other polearms was its substantial heft. Contemporary accounts suggest it required significant strength to wield effectively, but rewarded that strength with devastating impact. The substantial blade could deliver powerful chopping blows capable of shearing through shields, while the point maintained the thrusting capability essential for formation fighting. The sagas frequently mention the kestja in the hands of elite warriors and chieftains. In Egil's saga, the weapon features prominently in several key battles. Particularly brutal, was the Kesya's effectiveness against cavalry. The substantial blade could injure or kill horses while keeping riders at a distance, making it a specialized weapon for confronting mounted opponents, a tactical consideration that became increasingly important as Vikings expanded into territories where they might face armored horsemen. While the seax has received more historical attention, the humble knifer represented the most ubiquitous cutting implement in Viking society. Smaller than the seax and typically measuring 3 to 5 inches in blade length, the knifer was carried by virtually everyone, men, women, and even children, as an essential everyday tool. What made the knifer relevant as a weapon was its omnipresence and utility. These knives were razor sharp from constant maintenance, as they served for everything from food preparation to wood carving. When violence erupted unexpectedly, the knifer was always at hand, ready to be drawn from a belt sheath or neck lanyard. Archaeological evidence shows these knives were often carried in pairs or even sets of 3, each sized and shaped for different tasks. Many graves of both warriors and civilians contain multiple knifer, suggesting their importance transcended simple utility. The smaller size made them particularly effective for precise strikes to vulnerable areas, exactly the sort of opportunistic attack that might occur in close quarters or when primary weapons were unavailable. The cultural significance of the knifer extended beyond its practical uses. Gift knives often featured decorated handles or sheaths, and the quality of a person's everyday knife reflected their status and wealth. Far from being mere tools, these small blades held significant cultural importance and served as silent reminders that every Viking, warrior or not, had the means for violence close at hand. Viking shields themselves served as weapons, with the metal shield boss, the central metal dome, designed for offensive as well as defensive purposes. While the wooden shield with its iron reinforcement could block incoming strikes, the pronounced metal boss protruding from the center could be used to deliver stunning blows to an opponent's face or body. Archaeological findings show that many Viking shield bosses were not simply hemispherical, but featured a pronounced spike or point at the apex. This design transition wasn't decorative, it created a focused striking surface that could deliver tremendous force to a very small area, potentially puncturing armor or causing significant blunt trauma even through protective gear. The technique of shield striking appears repeatedly in Norse sagas, where warriors are described using their shields as offensive weapons in close combat. The shield boss strike was particularly effective when fighting in tight formations, where drawing back a weapon for a full swing might be impossible. A quick forward thrust with the shield could stun an opponent long enough to follow with a blade strike. This technique gained its brutal edge through the element of surprise. An opponent focused on avoiding a Viking's weapon might not anticipate the shield itself becoming a deadly implement. The Dane axe represents perhaps the most iconic Viking weapon that actually saw widespread historical use. Unlike the one-handed axes used with shields, the Dane axe was a two-handed weapon, featuring a broad, thin blade mounted on a shaft, typically ranging from 3 to 5 feet in length. This weapon gained prominence particularly in the later Viking Age and remained in use by their descendants in the Anglo-Scandinavian military traditions. Despite its impressive size, the Dane axe combined reach, cutting power, and surprising lightness to devastating effect. The thin blade and carefully balanced design made it remarkably maneuverable in skilled hands. With its long handle providing tremendous leverage, warriors could deliver powerful cuts capable of shearing through mail armor or severing limbs with a single stroke. Archaeological evidence shows these axes were often more carefully crafted than their utilitarian appearance might suggest. The blades were typically pattern welded with a harder steel edge, welded to a more flexible iron body, the same technique used in the finest swords. This sophisticated construction allowed the axe to maintain a razor edge while absorbing the shock of heavy strikes without shattering. The simple hand axe represents the most democratic weapon in the Viking arsenal. an everyday tool, found in virtually every household that doubled as an effective weapon when needed. Unlike specialized military axes, these were working tools designed primarily for woodcutting, construction, and shipbuilding. What made these ordinary axes effective weapons was their ubiquity and the familiarity their owners had with them. A Viking who spent hours each week using an axe for daily tasks developed the strength, coordination, and intuitive understanding needed to wield it effectively in combat. While lacking the specialized features of dedicated war axes, the typical hand axe still concentrated significant weight behind a relatively narrow cutting edge. Archaeological findings show these everyday axes were typically 12 to 16 inches in total length, with a modestly sized head weighing about 1 to 2 pounds. The blade shape varied based on primary function, with some featuring a broader edge for woodworking, while others had a more pointed profile better suited to splitting logs, and coincidentally, more effective for penetrating armor. The historical impact of these humble weapons shouldn't be underestimated. The first Viking raids on England and Francia were likely carried out by men armed primarily with their everyday tools rather than specialized military equipment. What makes these weapons particularly fascinating is how they blur the line between tool and weapon. In a society where every free person was expected to defend their community when called upon, the distinction between everyday implement and instrument of war was often non-existent. The same axe that built a longship might later be used to raid a coastal monastery. The knife that carved a child's toy might end an enemy's life in a shield wall clash. Yet, weapons are just a part of the Vikings' survival story. While their brutal arsenal earned them a fearsome reputation on the battlefield, the Norse people developed equally impressive strategies for thriving in harsh environments. The same pragmatic approach that shaped their weapons influenced their daily survival techniques.
Forget everything you think you know about Vikings. While Hollywood portrays them as mere raiders with crude weapons and boats, the reality would shock even modern engineers. These barbarians created technologies so advanced that scientists are still trying to fully understand them today. Some of their inventions were so ahead of their time that we didn't match their sophistication until centuries later, and a few still leave us scratching our heads. What you're about to discover isn't just a list of ancient tools. It's a window into a civilization whose technological achievements were so advanced that some of them remained unsurpassed until the Industrial Revolution. Prepare to have your perception of the Dark Ages completely transformed. Imagine trying to navigate across the world's most treacherous seas without a compass, GPS, or even a basic map. Now imagine doing it with such precision that you could reliably find a small island hundreds of miles away. This wasn't just a Viking achievement, it was their regular commute. At the heart of Viking navigation was one of history's most mysterious devices, the sunstone. Long dismissed as a myth, this crystalline compass was recently proven to work with shocking accuracy. Scientists testing Iceland spar, the likely stone used by Vikings, discovered it could determine the sun's position within 1 degree of accuracy, even in cloudy conditions or twilight. To put that in perspective, that's about the same margin of error as a modern handheld compass. But the sunstone was just one piece of their navigation puzzle. Vikings developed a sophisticated suite of tools and techniques that would make modern sailors envious. Their sun compass, a wooden disc with a central gnomon, could track their course with remarkable precision. Recent reconstructions show that on a clear day, this device could maintain a course accurate to within 1 degree over vast distances. That's comparable to using a basic GPS unit. Perhaps most impressively, Vikings mastered the art of reading nature itself. They developed techniques to navigate using everything from whale migration patterns to cloud formations. One technique involved observing the flight patterns of seabirds to determine distance from land, a method so reliable that World War II pilots were taught to use it for emergency navigation. Using astronomical cues and natural signs, this fail-safe navigation system ensured reliability, what modern experts call multimodal navigation. If one method failed, backups kept Vikings on course, making their wayfinding both sophisticated and resilient. Think modern steel is impressive? Viking blacksmiths were creating metal alloys so sophisticated that it took until the 1990s for scientists to finally understand how they did it. The most famous example was the legendary Ulfbert swords, weapons so advanced they were literally centuries ahead of their time. Far from just sharp pieces of metal, Ulfbert swords were a technological marvel. Modern analysis reveals they were forged from crucible steel with an astonishingly low level of impurities, something seemingly impossible for medieval technology. Their high carbon content surpassed anything in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. So advanced was the steel that if handed to a modern metallurgist without context, they might assume it came from a contemporary forge. Interestingly, Viking blacksmiths weren't just working with high-quality metal. They were pioneering entirely new forging techniques. They mastered pattern welding, a method similar to Damascus steel, which combined hardness with flexibility, allowing blades to stay sharp while absorbing impact. This wasn't decorative, it was an engineering breakthrough. Modern experiments show their furnaces reached over 2,732 degrees Fahrenheit or 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to fully liquefy iron. They developed advanced carbon infusion methods and impurity removal techniques that produced steel unmatched in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. Even more impressive, they achieved all this without understanding molecular chemistry, just centuries of careful observation. Recent studies reveal they tailored alloys for specific uses. Woodworking axes had different steel compositions than weapons, and boat-building tools had yet another formula. This wasn't just craftsmanship. It was precision engineering far ahead of its time. And if you think Viking weapons were just crude pieces of metal, modern experts would disagree. Recent analysis of Viking warfare technology has revealed engineering sophistication that wouldn't look out of place in a modern military R&D lab. Their weapons weren't just tools of war, they were masterpieces of applied physics and ergonomic design. Let's start with the legendary Ulfbert sword, which we touched on earlier. But it wasn't just the metal that was special. It was the entire design. The sword's balance point was so precisely engineered that modern replicas require computer assistance to achieve the same perfection. Each Ulfbert was essentially a medieval precision instrument, with weight distribution so perfect that it felt like an extension of the warrior's arm. Modern tests show these swords could bend nearly 90 degrees and spring back to true, a flexibility that modern steel would struggle to match. Viking shields were equally groundbreaking. Far from being clunky slabs of wood, they were engineered for both agility and protection. The center grip system they developed was so effective that it remained basically unchanged until the end of shield warfare. Their tapered grip distributed impact force along the arm instead of concentrating it at the wrist. The rim reinforcement technique allowed for lighter shield construction without sacrificing strength, while their innovative boss design could deflect blade strikes while protecting the hand. The Viking axe represents perhaps their greatest weapon innovation. Modern analysis has revealed that these weren't just sharpened wedges, they were precision-engineered cutting tools. The weight distribution was so precisely calculated that it maximized striking power while minimizing user fatigue. Recent physics analysis shows their axe design achieved nearly perfect energy transfer from swing to impact, something modern axe makers still strive for. But for versatility, nothing matched the spear, a true multi-role weapon platform. Designed for both ranged and melee combat, they could be thrown with deadly accuracy, wielded in close combat, used as walking sticks on long marches, and even served as measuring tools for boat building. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed something even more surprising: standardization. Viking weapons weren't just well crafted, they were produced to consistent specifications across regions, a level of uniformity Europe wouldn't see again until the early modern period. Viking blacksmiths achieved precision that would impress modern engineers with what we'd consider primitive tools, pushing the boundaries of metallurgy and manufacturing centuries ahead of their time. When modern naval architects studied Viking ship designs, they didn't find primitive boats. They found masterpieces of marine engineering that incorporated principles we didn't fully understand until the 20th century. These weren't just boats, they were the Formula One cars of the medieval seas, combining speed, durability, and innovation in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries. The most revolutionary aspect was their hull design. While the rest of Europe was building ships with rigid hulls, Vikings created what engineers now call a flexible hull system. Think of it like a modern suspension system for water. The hull could actually flex with the waves, making their ships both faster and more seaworthy. Modern tests have shown that this design reduced water resistance by up to 30% compared to contemporary ships and enabling speeds up to 15 knots. Their clinker-built construction, using overlapping planks and iron rivets, made them lighter, stronger, and easier to repair. Viking sails were just as advanced. While other European ships were using simple square sails, Vikings developed a sophisticated system that could harness the wind from almost any angle. Their woven rectangular sails adapted to wind pressure, achieving 85% of modern sailcloth efficiency. The steering system was equally ingenious, a side-mounted steering oar offering superior maneuverability and reduced drag, even allowing ships to sail backward. And instead of a fixed rudder, Vikings used a side-mounted steering oar that combined the functions of a rudder and a stabilizer. Modern marine engineers have discovered this system provided better maneuverability in rough seas while reducing drag compared to fixed rudders. The design allowed them to navigate in extremely shallow water and even sail their ships backward when needed, a capability that would be impressive even by today's standards. What's most impressive is how all these innovations work together. Each element, the flexible hull, the advanced sail, the sophisticated steering system, complemented the others, creating vessels that were greater than the sum of their parts. Long before urban planning was a profession, Vikings were creating settlements with sophisticated infrastructure that would make modern civil engineers nod in approval. These weren't just random collections of buildings. They were carefully planned communities designed to thrive in the harshest conditions imaginable. The most impressive aspect of Viking settlements wasn't just their buildings, it was their infrastructure. While medieval European cities drowned in their own waste, Viking towns featured advanced water management systems. Pitched streets naturally channeled rainwater away from buildings, while stone-lined drainage channels prevented erosion. Their filtration systems, using layers of rock and gravel, turned rainfall into a usable resource rather than a nuisance. Archaeologists have uncovered something even more shocking: grid patterns. While most medieval cities were chaotic mazes, Viking settlements often followed carefully planned layouts. These designs maximized natural light, optimized traffic flow, and even incorporated protection against prevailing winds, all while allowing for future expansion, concepts centuries ahead of their time. Their building foundations were equally innovative. Vikings used a technique called floating foundations, layering stones, gravel, and wood to create structures that could withstand shifting, frozen ground. Flexible joints allowed for slight movement without compromising stability, a method so effective that modern architects still study it. But Viking settlements weren't just practical. They were designed for community life. Carefully designated public spaces hosted markets, legal gatherings, and trade, recognizing that a thriving society needed more than just homes. Even more astonishing, evidence suggests urban zoning. Residential areas were separate from craft workshops, reducing fire risk and improving city organization. If you're picturing Vikings as grimy, unkempt warriors, archaeological evidence tells a shockingly different story. While the rest of medieval Europe was barely managing a bath per year, Vikings were developing hygiene practices and tools that would look surprisingly familiar on a modern bathroom counter. Their commitment to cleanliness wasn't just about looking good, it was an integral part of their culture that set them apart from their contemporaries. Archaeological digs across Viking settlements have unearthed an array of sophisticated grooming tools that would make a modern stylist jealous. Their combs, intricately carved from bone and antler, weren't just basic tools. They were precision instruments designed to remove even the smallest parasites. Modern microscopic analysis has revealed grooves so finely cut that they could trap and remove lice eggs, something many modern combs struggle to achieve. But it's their bathing culture that truly shatters stereotypes. While medieval Europeans avoided bathing, fearing it caused illness, Vikings built advanced bathing facilities. These weren't just sweat lodges, they were saunas with graduated heating areas and ventilation systems, doubling as social hubs where business was conducted, like modern power lunches, but with steam. The most surprising discovery came from analysis of Viking soap residue. They had developed cleaning agents using a combination of animal fats and wood ash lye that created a product remarkably similar to modern soap. Chemical analysis shows these soaps were sophisticated enough to kill bacteria, something that wouldn't be understood by science for nearly 1,000 years. Their attention to personal appearance went far beyond basic cleanliness. Excavations have uncovered ear picks, nail clippers, and beard trimming tools that wouldn't look out of place in a modern grooming kit. Their tweezers were precise enough to remove splinters, and their razors sharp enough for a clean shave, disproving the myth of the universally shaggy Viking. Next time you zip up your waterproof jacket or pull on your moisture-wicking base layer, spare a thought for the Vikings. While we credit modern science for these innovations, Viking textile makers were developing surprisingly similar solutions over 1,000 years ago. Their fabric technology wasn't just advanced for its time. It solved problems that modern outdoor gear companies are still tackling today. At the heart of Viking textile innovation was wool processing. They didn't just shear sheep and weave fabric. They developed specialized sorting and treatment techniques to create different grades of wool for specific uses. Some were fine enough to resemble modern merino, while others were so dense they repelled water like Gore-Tex. Modern analysis of preserved Viking textiles has revealed weave patterns so complex they require computer assistance to reproduce today. Their waterproofing techniques were just as advanced. Vikings combined wool grease, lanolin, with tree tar to create fabrics that resisted North Sea spray. Recent reconstructions show these treatments were nearly as effective as modern durable water repellent coatings. But unlike today's waterproofing, Viking treatments could last for years without reapplication. They also mastered layering systems. From lightweight, moisture-wicking base layers to dense, weather-resistant outer garments, Viking clothing wasn't just about warmth. It was a complete system that regulated temperature and moisture, much like modern technical gear. Even their dyeing technology was ahead of its time. They didn't just create basic colors. They developed chemical processes to produce dyes that resisted sun fading, salt water, and repeated washing. Some Viking blues were so color-fast that textile fragments unearthed after 1,000 years still retain their original hue. Modern textile companies would kill for that kind of color retention. The true genius of Viking textile makers wasn't just in their technical skills, it was in their deep understanding of performance clothing. They engineered garments for Arctic winters and Mediterranean summers, designed specialized fabrics for seafaring, and created textiles durable enough for combat. This wasn't just craft, it was engineering with thread and wool. Think about this for a moment. While most of Europe was fumbling in the so-called Dark Ages, Vikings were developing technologies that would make modern engineers pause in admiration. From their sophisticated metal alloys to their revolutionary ship designs, they weren't just surviving, they were innovating at a level that wouldn't be matched for centuries.
Vikings weren't just warriors, they were forged in the freeze, hardened by one of the most brutal climates on Earth, and their homes, just as unbreakable. These weren't cozy cabins. Viking longhouses were war-ready shelters, engineered to face howling winds, crushing snow, and cold that could snap bones. No blueprints, no power tools, not even nails. Yet some of these wooden beasts outlasted stone castles from the same era. The wildest part, they built them fast. A crew with axes and nothing but ancestral memory could raise one in a matter of weeks. So how did a primitive people pull off what modern builders struggle to match? When modern builders begin construction, they typically start with detailed plans, permits, and pouring concrete foundations. Vikings began with something far more valuable: generations of environmental knowledge. Site selection wasn't random, it was strategic genius. Vikings would spend days observing how water drained after rainfall, where snow accumulated during winter, and most importantly, how wind patterns affected different locations. They knew that choosing the wrong spot could mean the difference between a longhouse lasting 5 years or 50. Contrary to what many might assume, Vikings rarely built on completely flat ground. They actually preferred slight slopes with particular orientations to the sun. A longhouse built with its long axis, positioned east-west, would capture maximum solar heat during winter months while minimizing wind exposure during storms. This passive solar orientation reduced heating needs by up to 30% compared to randomly oriented structures, a technique rediscovered by green architects only in the 1970s. Once the perfect site was secured, Vikings established a foundation system that would make modern engineers rethink their reliance on concrete. Rather than digging deep foundations susceptible to frost heave in freezing climates, they created a floating foundation. Large support posts, averaging 30 to 40 centimeters in diameter, were set on flat stones rather than buried directly in the ground. This seemingly simple approach had profound advantages. It prevented moisture wicking from soil into wooden posts, allowed for seasonal ground movement without structural damage, and made repairs remarkably straightforward. The structural frame itself used what we now call post and beam construction, a a system so effective it's still used in high-end homes today. Support posts would be erected at regular intervals, typically 1.5 to 2 meters apart, connected by horizontal beams that distributed weight evenly. What's particularly impressive is how these elements were joined. Instead of relying solely on nails, which were precious resources, Vikings used sophisticated joinery techniques including mortise and tenon connections, lap joints, and wooden pegs. Measurements weren't random either. Archaeological evidence shows remarkable consistency in proportions across buildings throughout Scandinavia, suggesting standardized building practices that predated modern construction codes by a millennium. The typical longhouse maintained a width-to-height ratio of approximately 1 to 0.8, a proportion that maximized interior space, while ensuring structural stability during high winds. And it wouldn't take long for the framework to rise. A team of 5 to 7 experienced builders could erect the main structural elements of a medium-sized longhouse, approximately 15 to 20 meters in length, in just 3 to 5 days. The efficiency came from pre-cutting and preparing major components before assembly began, essentially creating the world's first prefabricated building system. What truly set Viking construction apart, however, was its brilliant flexibility. The curved walls characteristic of many longhouses weren't just aesthetic choices. They created a structure that could flex slightly during storms, rather than rigidly resisting force until breaking. This dynamic structural response allowed Viking longhouses to withstand wind forces that would damage more rigid buildings, much like how modern skyscrapers are designed to sway during earthquakes. With this foundation and framework established, the stage was set for the next phase, transforming raw materials into building components that could stand against the harsh Nordic elements. If you've ever played with building blocks as a child, you understand the fundamental truth that your creation is only as good as its components. Vikings took this principle to an almost obsessive level. Contrary to popular belief, Vikings didn't simply chop down the nearest trees and start building. Material gathering followed strict seasonal timing that maximized quality while minimizing effort. Oak and pine, the primary structural woods, were harvested in winter when their sap content was lowest, dramatically reducing later warping and insect infestation. This single practice extended the lifespan of wooden components by 15 to 20 years compared to summer-cut timber. The ingenuity escalated once trees were felled. Logs destined for critical structural elements were submerged in salt water for 1 to 3 months, a natural preservation technique that impregnated the wood with salt and significantly enhanced rot resistance. Archaeological finds show that properly salt-treated posts could last up to 30 years in direct ground contact, compared to just 5 to 7 years for untreated wood. Beyond the main structure lies an even more fascinating story of material innovation. Vikings didn't just build with whatever was at hand. They strategically sourced specific materials for specific functions. For walls, a combination of split planks, wattle, and daub, a mixture of clay, sand, animal dung, and straw, created surprisingly effective insulation. Modern testing of reconstructed sections shows these walls achieved an insulation value roughly equivalent to a modern wall, with 3 inches of fiberglass insulation. Quite remarkable for primitive technology. Roofing materials demonstrated similar sophistication. The outer layer typically used overlapping wooden shingles or sheets of birch bark topped with sod. This wasn't just about keeping rain out. The living sod layer continued to grow, creating a self-healing membrane that could last decades with minimal maintenance. The weight of these living roofs, approximately 160 to 200 kilograms per square meter, also compressed wall materials, naturally increasing their insulation value while helping stabilize the entire structure. What set Viking builders apart was their deep understanding of wood. They knew different trees behaved differently. Birch flexed, oak held firm, and they used each where it made the most sense. A single longhouse needed up to 70 mature trees, so waste wasn't an option. Through precise splitting instead of sawing, they squeezed up to 30% more out of every trunk, turning one oak into posts, planks, and furniture. Material prep could take months, but by the time construction began, they had a custom-fit kit designed by nature and sharpened by generations of experience. Imagine building a 25-meter structure without a single measuring tape, level, or power saw. Seems impossible, doesn't it? Yet Vikings did exactly this. Using construction techniques so clever, they compensated for the lack of modern tools, while sometimes achieving greater precision. The construction process began with setting the main support posts on their stone footings. Rather than relying on measuring tools, Viking builders used ropes with knots tied at specific intervals, an ancient form of measuring tape that could be easily reproduced or replaced. Archaeological evidence suggests these rope measures were standardized within communities, allowing for remarkable consistency. Post holes at excavated longhouse sites typically vary by less than 5 centimeters across dozens of meters, precision that would challenge even modern builders. With the main posts positioned, the real craftsmanship emerged. Horizontal beams were notched to fit precisely onto the posts using a technique called scarf jointing. And because nails were too valuable to use extensively, these joints had to be self-securing through precise woodworking. Using axes sharpened to almost surgical precision, Viking craftsmen could create joints with gaps smaller than 2 millimeters, tight enough to prevent water penetration and structural movement. Regional adaptations appear clearly in wall construction methods. In coastal Norway, walls typically consisted of vertical planks slotted into grooved base beams, while Danish longhouses often featured the wattle and daub approach mentioned earlier. These weren't just aesthetic differences, they reflected adaptations to local climate conditions and available materials. The roof presented the ultimate challenge. Supporting the immense weight of wooden shingles and sod, up to 30 tons for a medium-sized longhouse, required both engineering know-how and cooperative muscle power. The roof structure typically used paired rafters meeting at the center ridgepole, creating triangular support systems every 1.5 to 2 meters along the building's length. These weren't simply lashed together. They were joined using complex notching that distributed weight evenly while locking components together. In a brilliant rejection of perfectionism, Vikings understood that absolute symmetry, while aesthetically pleasing, wasn't always structurally necessary. Roof pitches typically ranged from 45 to 53 degrees, steep enough to shed snow effectively, but not so steep as to catch the full force of winter gales. This range allowed builders to adjust based on local weather patterns, creating steeper roofs in higher snowfall regions. And surprisingly, all of this took little time. Once materials were prepared, a community working together could complete a medium-sized longhouse in approximately 2 to 3 weeks. This speed came from highly specialized task allocation, with experienced craftsmen handling critical joints while less skilled workers prepared thatch bundles or mixed daub. The finishing touches revealed an unexpected artistic flair. Interior walls were lined with a clay mixture of fine sand and sometimes animal blood, acting as a natural binder similar to modern latex additives. This was applied in thin layers, partially dried, and burnished with stones to create a hard, waterproof surface that reflected firelight throughout the interior. What emerged wasn't just shelter, but a finely tuned system managing temperature, moisture, and air quality. Despite being labeled as barbarians, Vikings used design principles scientifically validated only in the last century. The real question isn't how they built such effective structures, but why we abandoned these proven methods for more resource-intensive modern ones. Step inside a reconstructed Viking longhouse today, and your first impression might be of darkness and simplicity. You'd be missing the point entirely. The interior layout of a Viking longhouse wasn't just arranged, it was choreographed to support daily life in extraordinarily challenging conditions. The typical longhouse interior followed a linear organization with a central hearth, or series of hearths, running down the middle of the structure. This wasn't merely a cooking arrangement. It was the core of an integrated heating and ventilation system that predated modern HVACs by a millennium. Far from merely huddling around the fire to stay warm, they arranged hearths, sleeping platforms, and work areas to create a sophisticated airflow pattern that distributed heat and managed smoke. Sleeping platforms were typically elevated 40 to 60 centimeters above the floor level, placing occupants in the warmest air zone, while smoke naturally rose toward vented areas in the roof. This air stratification strategy is identical to principles used in high-efficiency passive solar homes today. The sleeping arrangements themselves reveal the ingenious practicality of Viking design. Beds were typically positioned along the long walls, furthest from doors but closest to the structural walls where draft risk was highest. This placement served multiple functions. It created a thermal buffer zone between sleepers and the exterior, utilized body heat to warm the walls from the inside, and maximized the usable central space during daylight hours. Light management transformed these seemingly dark interiors into functional spaces. Small openings at strategic points, not large enough to create significant heat loss, allowed daylight to enter, while smoke holes in the roof provided additional illumination. The positioning of these openings wasn't random. Archaeological evidence shows they were often arranged to highlight specific work areas at different times of day as the sun moved across the sky. At night, the Vikings employed a lighting system that was remarkably efficient for its time. Rather than using precious beeswax candles, they developed lamps that burned fish oil or animal fat in soapstone containers. These lamps produced less smoke than torches, while providing sustainable illumination for extended periods. The strategic placement of polished metal or light-colored materials behind these light sources served as crude reflectors, amplifying available light. The longhouse interior reveals a deep understanding of community flow and efficiency. Spaces transitioned from public to private. Entry zones acted as airlocks. Central hearth areas served for communal work and dining, and private sleeping quarters sat at the ends for quiet and separation. Workspaces were strategically placed for natural light, supporting tasks like food prep and textiles. What stands out is how multifunctional everything was. Storage was built into the structure. Sleeping platforms became daytime seating. Even support posts carried symbolic carvings while reinforcing the frame. In a 15 to 20 meter space, up to 30 people lived, worked, and socialized using just a third of the resources modern homes require, thanks to ingenious design, not overcrowding. To modernize, it might seem basic, but Viking longhouses were masterfully engineered survival hubs, tailored to thrive in brutal environments. But even the most intelligently designed interior would be meaningless without effective protection from the Nordic elements, a challenge Vikings met with astonishing effectiveness. A typical winter storm in coastal Norway can deliver wind speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, temperatures plunging to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and snowfall that would paralyze a modern city. For the Vikings, weathering such conditions wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Their solution? Turn the structure itself into a shield. The weatherproofing systems in Viking longhouses began with the roof. Unlike modern roofs designed primarily to shed water, Viking roofs had to manage a complex mix of challenges: heavy snow loads, driving rain, howling winds, and temperature differentials that would cause less thoughtful structures to crack and fail. The solution was multi-layered brilliance. Beneath the visible sod layer lay carefully overlapped birch bark sheets, nature's perfect waterproofing membrane. Birch bark contains naturally water-resistant resins that, when properly layered, create an almost impermeable barrier. Testing on reconstructed roofs has shown that properly installed birch bark layers can remain watertight for 30+ years with minimal maintenance. During heavy rains, water would simply channel down the bark layers to the roof edge, while the insulating properties of the sod layer above prevented rapid temperature fluctuations that could crack or damage the waterproofing system. But it's the wind management aspects that truly showcase Viking engineering intelligence. The aerodynamic profile of longhouses, with their low eaves and carefully calculated roof pitch, created a structure that essentially deflected wind rather than fighting it head-on. Snow patterns around excavated longhouse sites suggest that these buildings created their own microclimate, with snowdrifts forming in predictable patterns that actually provided additional insulation during the coldest months. Insulation strategies varied regionally, but followed consistent principles. In coastal areas with milder but wetter conditions, walls packed with seaweed provided excellent thermal resistance while naturally repelling insects due to the salt content. The most vulnerable points in any structure are its openings, and Viking solutions were remarkably effective. Doorways featured multiple ingenious details, slightly raised thresholds to prevent water ingress, sophisticated wooden door constructions with overlapping planks to minimize drafts, and, in many cases, angled entry passages that created natural airlocks. These entry passages served multiple functions. They reduced direct wind penetration, created transition zones between outdoor and indoor temperatures, and provided storage space for outdoor equipment. Smoke management reveals another dimension of Viking practical genius. Rather than simply cutting holes in the roof, which would create problematic rain entry points, they developed controllable vent systems. Wooden panels that could be adjusted using poles allowed occupants to fine-tune airflow based on wind direction and interior conditions. In some reconstructed longhouses, these systems have demonstrated the ability to clear smoke while minimizing heat loss with surprising efficiency. During the darkest winter months, when temperatures remained below freezing for weeks on end, Vikings employed additional survival strategies within the longhouse design. Archaeological evidence suggests they sometimes brought livestock into sectioned-off portions of the structure during extreme weather, not just to protect valuable animals, but because the body heat from cattle and sheep contributed significantly to overall warmth. A single cow produces approximately the same heat as a 1 kilowatt electric heater, making a small herd a substantial heat source in desperate conditions. Water management extended beyond simply keeping rain out. Drainage channels excavated around longhouse foundations directed snowmelt and rainwater away from the structure, while gravel layers beneath floor surfaces prevented ground moisture from rising into the living space. These measures didn't just protect the building materials, they created healthier interior conditions by reducing humidity and preventing mold growth. The comprehensive approach to weatherproofing wasn't just effective, it was life-saving. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that during the harshest recorded winter events, communities with well-constructed longhouses survived with remarkably low casualty rates compared to other pre-modern cultures facing similar climate extremes. What emerges from this examination isn't just a picture of clever building techniques, but a holistic survival strategy encoded in architectural form. The Viking longhouse represents one of history's most successful adaptations to extreme environmental challenges, a testament to human ingenuity and the power of generational knowledge accumulation.